The rain poured down in relentless sheets, drenching the streets of Michigan as James Miller tightened his grip on the steering wheel. His knuckles whitened, veins pulsing with a mix of anger and dread. He didn't even notice the rhythmic thud of windshield wipers, his mind consumed by the text message he'd seen on Sarah's phone just hours earlier. "Can't wait to see you tonight, room 214. The words seared into his brain. Room 214, a number he would never forget. His wife, the woman he had built his life with, the mother of his children, was meeting someone else. The gut punch of betrayal was unbearable, yet it wasn't enough to stop him from seeking answers. Tonight he would find the truth, no matter how devastating. Pulling into the hotel parking lot, he killed the engine. For a moment, James sat in silence, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. He stared at the golden glow of the lobby lights, a stark contrast to the dark storm raging outside. And within him, he could feel his heart pounding, echoing in his chest like a war drum. He wanted to turn back, to pretend this wasn't happening, but the image of his children, oblivious to their mother's deceit, pushed him forward. They deserved better. He deserved better. James stepped into the lobby, his wet boots squeaking on the polished tiles. The warmth inside felt suffocating compared to the cool rain outside. The receptionist barely glanced up as he walked past, eyes scanning the room. His gaze landed on the elevators. Room 214 was upstairs. He hesitated, the enormity of what he was about to face weighing on him. But then he heard it, a burst of laughter coming from the bar. His head snapped toward the sound. There she was, Sarah, sitting at a dimly lit corner table with a man James had never seen before. They were close, too close. Her hand rested on his arm as she leaned in, her smile radiant, carefree, as if she weren't tearing their family apart with every passing second. Time slowed as James took in the scene, the way her eyes sparkled, the way she laughed like she hadn't in years, not with him at least. His chest tightened, the air around him suddenly too heavy to breathe. 1,000 emotions surged within him, anger, betrayal, sadness, but most of all, disbelief. How could she? He moved closer, unnoticed. His boots no longer squeaked. The storm of his presence had silenced everything around him. When he reached the edge of their table, Sarah finally noticed him. Her laughter stopped, her face draining of color as if she'd seen a ghost. "James?" Her voice trembled, barely audible over the pounding in his ears. The man beside her, tall, confident, with an air of arrogance, shifted in his seat, his smile fading. He glanced at James, then back at Sarah, his expression calm, almost smug. James couldn't believe it. This was no innocent misunderstanding. This man knew exactly who he was. "Who's this?" the man asked, his voice dripping with condescension. James clenched his fists, his voice a low growl. "I'm her husband. Who the hell are you?" The man leaned back casually, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I'm Ryan. Nice to meet you." Ryan's audacity was the match that lit James's simmering fury. He slammed his fist onto the table, rattling their glasses. "This is what you've been doing, Sarah? This is where our money's going? To this?" Sarah's mouth opened, but no words came out. Her silence was louder than any excuse she could have given. Tears welled in her eyes, but James didn't care. He couldn't care. Not now. Ryan stood, his smug demeanor unchanged. "Listen, man, maybe you should calm down. Sarah and I—" "Don't you dare say her name," James barked, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. He stepped closer, towering over Ryan. "You don't know a damn thing about her, about us." "Clearly neither do you," Ryan shot back, his smirk widening. James's restraint snapped. He grabbed Ryan by the collar, pulling him forward as glasses shattered on the table. "You think this is funny?" His voice cracked with the weight of his anger. "You think breaking apart a family is some kind of joke?" "James, stop!" Sarah finally found her voice, standing between them. Her hands trembled as she pushed against his chest. "Please let him go!" The plea in her voice cut deeper than any of Ryan's taunts. James released him, shoving him back into his chair. Ryan adjusted his collar, his cocky grin faltering for the first time. "I'm done," James spat, his voice shaking. "Done with your lies, your betrayal. Whatever this is, you can have it. But you won't take my kids, Sarah. You won't take what's left of our life." He turned, storming out of the hotel without waiting for her response. The rain greeted him like an old friend, cold and relentless. He stood there, letting it wash over him, his tears indistinguishable from the storm. Tonight, everything had changed. The morning after the confrontation, James sat in the silence of his living room. The faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen was the only sound. He hadn't slept. His thoughts raced through every moment, every sign he'd missed. Sarah's laughter, Ryan's arrogance, it all replayed in his mind like a broken record. His children stirred upstairs, their muffled giggles a bittersweet reminder of what he had to protect. He rubbed his temples, trying to push away the image of Sarah leaning toward Ryan at the bar. What haunted him most wasn't just her betrayal. It was her ease in lying, her willingness to throw everything away. For what? A man like that? A sharp ding from his phone pulled him back to the present, a new bank alert. He hesitated before opening it. Another withdrawal, this time $1,500 from their savings account. His jaw clenched. This wasn't just an affair anymore. This was theft. Their money, their future. She was funneling it into whatever fantasy life she'd constructed with Ryan. James called the bank, his voice tight as he requested the details. "Can you confirm the vendor for that charge?" he asked. "Yes, sir," the representative replied. "It's a transaction from Luxe Boutique downtown. The purchase was made in person yesterday." Yesterday. The same day she'd laughed at Ryan's jokes while James was home, helping their daughter with her math homework. He ended the call abruptly, his chest tight with a mix of anger and helplessness. The boutique. He'd been there once before, buying Sarah a necklace for their anniversary. A wave of nausea hit him as he realized she wasn't spending that money on their family. She was lavishing it on Ryan. Later that day, James drove to the boutique. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to uncover. The polished storefront gleamed under the late morning sun, mocking him with its pristine perfection. He stepped inside, greeted by a saleswoman who seemed eager to help. "I need to return something," he said, sliding the receipt across the counter. "It was purchased yesterday." The saleswoman glanced at the receipt, then at James. "I'm sorry, sir, but this item has already been picked up. A man came in last night to collect it." "A man?" James's stomach dropped. "What did he look like?" "Tall, dark hair, wearing a suit," she said. "Is everything okay? He mentioned he was picking it up for his partner. It seemed romantic." Romantic? The word hung in the air like a bitter reminder of what he'd lost. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to nod politely before walking out. His mind raced. Sarah hadn't even been the one to collect the gift. She'd bought it for Ryan, and he had the audacity to pick it up himself. James gripped the steering wheel as he sat in his car, staring blankly at the dashboard. The betrayal wasn't just a fracture anymore. It was a canyon. She was funneling their life savings into a man who couldn't even be bothered to keep his involvement discreet. His pulse pounded in his ears. He couldn't let this go on. That night, Sarah came home late, her hair slightly damp from the rain. She dropped her keys on the counter, avoiding James's gaze. He stood at the kitchen table, the receipt and bank statement laid out in front of him like damning evidence. "Another late night?" he asked, his voice low but steady. She froze, her hand lingering on the edge of her purse. "Work ran late." "Work?" He laughed bitterly. "Is that what you call it now?" Her eyes flicked to the papers on the table, her expression hardening. "I don't know what you're trying to accuse me of, James, but I'm not doing this tonight." "You're not doing this tonight?" He stepped closer, his tone sharpening. "You've drained $1,500 from our savings." "Our savings, Sarah. And you think you can just walk in here and pretend nothing's wrong?" Her shoulders stiffened, but she didn't look away this time. "I needed it. For me. I've sacrificed everything for this family, and maybe for once I deserve something too." James shook his head in disbelief. "You deserved something? What about what our kids deserve? What about the life we've worked so hard to build? Don't you dare make this about them," she snapped. "You've been checked out for years, James, always at work, always too busy to notice what I've been going through." Her words hit him like a slap. Was she rewriting their history now, blaming him for her betrayal? He felt the familiar pang of guilt, the creeping doubt that maybe he hadn't been enough. But then he remembered Ryan, the man at the bar, the smug grin, the $1,500 gone in an instant. "Save your excuses, Sarah," he said coldly. "I've seen enough. You want to talk about sacrifice? Let's talk about what you're sacrificing right now. This family. Us." Sarah's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. Instead, she grabbed her purse and stormed toward the stairs, leaving him alone with the crushing weight of her silence. James sank into a chair, staring at the pile of receipts and statements in front of him. This wasn't just deceit, it was destruction, and he couldn't sit idly by while she tore their lives apart. James stared at the glow of his phone screen in the darkened room. The sound of his children's laughter from earlier in the evening had long since faded into silence, replaced by the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. The words on Sarah's phone from the night before were etched into his mind. "This weekend will be unforgettable. Can't wait to see you again." He'd already seen enough to know she was lying to him, but now he was determined to uncover everything. Sliding into his chair at the dining table, James opened his laptop and began to sift through their finances once more. His hands trembled as he clicked through the bank statements, searching for patterns, for clues. And there they were, consistent withdrawals, always from the same ATM downtown, always around lunchtime. A total of $8,000 over the last 2 months. Where had it gone? His mind reeled with possibilities, each one worse than the last. He leaned back, exhaling sharply. There was only one way to find out. Grabbing his phone, he typed in a name he hadn't used in years, Mark, his old friend from college who now worked as a private investigator. It was a call James never thought he'd have to make. "Mark, it's me," James said, his voice low, almost as if Sarah might hear him from upstairs. "James?" Mark's voice came through with a mixture of surprise and concern. "It's been a while. What's going on?" "I need your help," James said, the words catching in his throat. "It's Sarah. She's been lying to me, draining our accounts, meeting someone. I need to know who he is." Mark paused. "Are you sure you want to go down this road, man? Once you start, there's no going back." James closed his eyes, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. "I have no choice. I need to know the truth." The conversation ended quickly, Mark agreeing to take the case. As James set the phone down, his chest felt heavy. He was crossing a line, one that might shatter what little hope he had left of salvaging his marriage. But the thought of Sarah and Ryan together, their laughter, their plans, spurred him forward. The next day, Mark called with the first update. "James, I followed her today. She met him at a cafe downtown, the one near the park. They were there for about an hour and then they left together. She drove him back to his place." James's stomach churned. "Did you get anything else?" "Yeah. His name is Ryan. He's been in trouble with the law before. Fraud, mostly. Looks like he's good at charming people out of their money." Fraud. The word hit James like a sledgehammer. This wasn't just about Sarah's betrayal anymore. Ryan was a predator, and Sarah had fallen right into his trap. Or worse, she'd walked into it willingly. That evening, Sarah was late coming home again. When she finally walked through the door, James was waiting for her, standing by the dining table. His laptop was open, the bank statements displayed prominently on the screen. "Busy day?" James asked, his tone deceptively calm. Sarah froze, her keys still in her hand. "I don't want to do this right now, James." "Oh, we're doing this," he said, stepping closer. $8,000, Sarah, that's how much you've taken from our accounts. Want to explain where it went?" Her face hardened. "I don't owe you an explanation for every dollar I spend." "Every dollar you spend?" His voice rose, anger bubbling to the surface. "This isn't pocket change, Sarah. This is money for our kids, for our future. You think you can just steal it and get away with it?" "I didn't steal anything," she snapped. "I took what I needed." "For what?" James demanded. "For him? For Ryan?" Her eyes widened, the color draining from her face. That was all the confirmation James needed. "You don't get to play the victim here," he said, his voice breaking. "You've been lying to me, to all of us. Do you even care about this family anymore?" Sarah looked away, her silence louder than any excuse she could have made. James took a deep breath, his hands gripping the back of the chair in front of him. "Mark found out who he is, Sarah. Ryan. A con man, a criminal. That's who you're throwing everything away for." "That's not fair," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You don't know him." "Fair?" James laughed bitterly. "You think any of this is fair? You've lied to me, stolen from me, humiliated me, and now you're defending him?" Her hands shook as she placed her keys on the counter. "I didn't mean for this to happen, James. I felt invisible." "Invisible?" James's voice cracked, the weight of her words cutting deep. "You think that justifies destroying our family? You think that justifies this?" Sarah didn't answer. She turned and walked upstairs, leaving James standing alone in the kitchen, the cold glow of the laptop screen reflecting the broken pieces of their life. James stood outside the hotel lobby, his breath fogging in the cold night air. The faint hum of cars passing by on the main road was drowned out by the pounding of his heart. Inside, behind those polished glass doors, was Sarah, the woman he'd built a life with, the woman who was, at this very moment, sitting with the man who had stolen her away from him. He pushed open the door, the soft chime of the bell above barely registering in his ears. The warmth inside hit him like a wall, but it did nothing to soften the icy resolve coursing through his veins. The lobby was quiet, almost serene. It made him feel like an intruder, like he was the one disrupting the peace, but he wasn't the one who'd broken their vows. His eyes scanned the room. Then he saw them, Sarah and Ryan sitting in the corner of the hotel bar. She was leaning in close, her hand resting lightly on his arm, laughing at something he'd said. James's stomach turned. That laugh, the one he hadn't heard in years, now belonged to someone else. As he approached, his footsteps felt heavier, the distance between them stretching endlessly. And then she looked up. Her laughter died instantly, her face draining of color as she met his gaze. Ryan followed her line of sight, his expression shifting from confusion to calm indifference. "James," Sarah said, her voice barely audible. James stopped at the edge of their table, his fists clenched at his sides. "Enjoying yourselves?" he asked, his tone sharp, his voice trembling just enough to betray the storm inside him. Ryan leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. "And you must be the husband," he said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "Nice to finally meet you." James's jaw tightened. "Get up," he growled, his eyes locked on Ryan. Ryan didn't move. Instead, he smiled. "I don't think that's necessary. Why don't you sit down, have a drink? Sarah and I were just—" "Get up." James's voice was louder now, drawing the attention of a few patrons nearby. His pulse pounded in his ears, his vision narrowing until Ryan was the only thing he could see. "James, stop," Sarah said, standing and placing herself between them. Her voice was trembling, her hands raised as if to calm him. "Please, let's just what?" James cut her off, his voice cracking under the weight of his emotions. "Let's just pretend this isn't happening? Let's just ignore the fact that you've been lying to me? Lying to our kids? Draining our savings for this? He gestured sharply toward Ryan, his words catching in his throat. Ryan stood now, his hands raised in mock surrender. "Hey, man, I get it, you're upset. But let's not make a scene." "A scene?" James took a step forward, his fists trembling at his sides. "You think this is about a scene? You think this is some misunderstanding we can talk our way out of?" "James, please," Sarah begged, her voice breaking. She reached for his arm, but he pulled away, his eyes never leaving Ryan. "You don't get to tell me to stop," James said, his voice low, trembling with fury. "Not after everything you've done. Not after him." Ryan smirked. "Look, I didn't steal her. She came to me. Maybe if you'd been paying more attention, this wouldn't have happened." The words hit James like a slap. In an instant, his restraint snapped. He lunged forward, grabbing Ryan by the collar and shoving him against the wall. The sound of a glass shattering nearby barely registered as James's voice filled the room. "You think you can just waltz in and take everything I've worked for? Everything I love?" His voice cracked, the weight of his heartbreak spilling out with every word. "You're nothing. You're a parasite. James, stop it!" Sarah's voice was desperate now, her hands pulling at his arm. You're going to make this worse." "Worse?" James let go, shoving Ryan back into his chair. He turned to Sarah, his chest heaving. "How could it possibly get worse than this, Sarah? You've destroyed everything, and for what? Him?" Her eyes welled with tears, but she didn't respond. For the first time, she had no defense, no excuse, no lie. She looked away, her silence screaming louder than any words could. James took a step back, his fists unclenching, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his pain. "I hope he's worth it," he said, his voice quieter now, almost defeated. "Because you just lost everything." He turned and walked away, the murmur of onlookers filling the space behind him. The cold night air hit him as he stepped outside, but he barely felt it. His hands were shaking, his mind racing. The image of Sarah and Ryan burned into his memory, a scar he knew would never fade. The house was quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that made James's skin crawl. It wasn't peace. It was the calm before a storm. He sat at the kitchen table, his head in his hands, the clock on the wall ticking louder with every passing second. The confrontation at the hotel had left him raw, but what followed in the days after had cut even deeper. Sarah hadn't come home that night, nor the next. She didn't call, didn't text. She'd chosen Ryan, that much was clear. But James wasn't prepared for the fallout that would come. On the third day, a thick envelope arrived in the mail. James stared at it for a long time before finally tearing it open. Inside were overdue bills and a notice from the bank. Sarah had maxed out their joint credit card. Thousands of dollars spent on lavish dinners, boutique shopping, and hotel stays. His chest tightened, the enormity of her actions closing in on him like a vice. He dropped the papers on the table, his hands shaking. Every dollar was supposed to be for their family, for the kids. How could she do this? The answer came quickly. She hadn't cared. Not about him, not about their future. James picked up his phone and called Mark, his old friend and now the investigator digging into Ryan's background. "I need everything," he said, his voice low and strained. "Whatever dirt you can find on this guy, I want it." "I've already got something for you," Mark replied. "Ryan's not just some con man. He's got a history of targeting women, using their money until there's nothing left. And he's done it all over the state." James's grip tightened on the phone. "And Sarah? Does she know?" "Probably not," Mark said. "But I wouldn't count on her believing you if you tell her." James hung up, the weight of Mark's words sinking in. Ryan wasn't just destroying their family, he was destroying Sarah too. And she was letting him. That evening, James sat his children down at the dinner table. Their young faces were full of questions he didn't know how to answer. "Where's Mom?" his daughter asked, her small voice cracking. She's staying somewhere else right now," James said, forcing a weak smile. "But I'm here, okay? I'm not going anywhere." His son frowned, his little hands gripping his fork tightly. "Did you fight? Is that why she's gone?" James's throat tightened. "Sometimes grown-ups fight," he said carefully. "But it doesn't mean we don't love you. It's just complicated." The words felt hollow, but what else could he say? He couldn't tell them the truth. Not yet. Later that night, as the kids slept, James sat alone in the living room. The television played quietly in the background, but he wasn't watching. He stared at his phone, scrolling through Sarah's social media accounts, searching for something, anything that might give him answers. And then he found it. A photo. Sarah and Ryan, smiling together at a restaurant he didn't recognize. Her caption read, "Sometimes you find happiness where you least expect it." Happiness. The word burned like acid. James's jaw clenched as he stared at the screen, his mind racing. She wasn't just hiding their relationship, she was flaunting it. She didn't care who saw. She didn't care how it made him feel. He stood abruptly, pacing the room. This wasn't just betrayal, it was humiliation. She'd taken everything from him, his trust, his money, his dignity, and handed it to someone who didn't deserve it. The next morning, James called his lawyer. "I want to file for divorce," he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "And I want full custody of the kids." The words felt like a release, a small victory in a battle he hadn't asked to fight. But it wasn't enough. He needed to confront Sarah again to make her see the destruction she'd caused. That afternoon, he drove to Ryan's apartment. It was a rundown building on the edge of town, a stark contrast to the luxurious image Ryan tried to portray. James banged on the door, his anger barely contained. When Sarah opened it, her eyes widened in shock. "What are you doing here?" she asked, stepping outside and closing the door behind her. "We need to talk," James said, his voice firm. "Now." She crossed her arms, her gaze darting away. "I don't have anything to say to you." "Then you can listen," he snapped. "You think this is about you and Ryan? It's not. This is about our kids, about the life you're throwing away for some con artist." Sarah's face hardened. "You don't know him. You don't know anything about what I've been through." "I know enough," James shot back. "I know he's using you. I know he's done this before, and I know he doesn't care about you, Sarah, not like I did." Her eyes glistened, but she didn't say anything. For a moment, James thought he'd gotten through to her. But then she shook her head. "You don't understand," she whispered. "You never did." James stared at her, the woman he'd once loved, now a stranger standing before him. "Maybe I don't," he said quietly, "but I'm done trying." He turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the cold, the weight of their broken life hanging heavy in the air. James sat in the quiet office of his lawyer, the soft click of a keyboard breaking the silence. His fingers tapped anxiously against the arm of his chair as the lawyer, a stern-looking man named Greg Carter, reviewed the documents on his desk. The weight of the last few weeks pressed heavily on James's shoulders, but this moment felt like the first step toward reclaiming control. "This," Greg said, finally looking up, "is solid. We've got evidence of financial misconduct, proof of the affair, and a pattern of neglect. If we present this in court, you have a very strong case for full custody." James nodded, but the words didn't bring him the relief he thought they would. "What happens to Sarah?" he asked quietly. Greg paused, his brow furrowing. "That depends. If her lawyer tries to fight for joint custody, we'll have to push harder. But if she doesn't contest, it'll make things easier. For you and the kids." James looked down at his hands, his fingers clenching into fists. "She doesn't deserve them," he said, his voice low. "Not after what she's done." Greg leaned back in his chair. "Then let's make sure the court knows that." The meeting ended with a stack of paperwork and a clear plan. James left the office feeling both resolved and hollow. He didn't want to take his children away from their mother, but he couldn't let them stay in the chaos Sarah had created. Later that evening, James sat at the kitchen table, staring at the custody petition in front of him. The house was quiet. Too quiet. His son's toy car sat abandoned on the floor, a reminder of the laughter that had once filled these walls. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Opening it, he found Mark standing on the porch holding a folder. "I dug a little deeper on Ryan," Mark said, stepping inside. "You're not going to like this." James's stomach churned as he took the folder. Inside were police reports, court documents, and witness statements. Ryan had a history of fraud and manipulation, targeting women and draining their finances before disappearing. But what stood out most was a restraining order filed by a previous victim. "He's dangerous," Mark said, his voice heavy. "And he's got Sarah wrapped around his finger." James's grip tightened on the folder. "Does she know?" "Probably not, but even if she did, I'm not sure she'd care. She's in too deep." The anger James had been holding back surged to the surface. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about protecting his children, from Ryan, from Sarah, from the destruction they were spiraling toward. The next day, James filed the paperwork. The courthouse was cold and unfeeling, but as he handed the documents to the clerk, he felt a flicker of hope. This was the right thing to do. That evening, Sarah showed up at the house. It was the first time he'd seen her in days. Her face was pale, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. She stood on the porch, clutching her purse like a lifeline. "We need to talk," she said, her voice trembling. James stepped aside, letting her in. She walked into the living room, her movements hesitant, like she didn't recognize the place anymore. "I heard about the custody filing," she said, turning to face him. "Is this really what you want?" "What I want," James's voice was sharp, cutting through the tension in the room. "I want my kids to have a stable home. I want them to feel safe. Can you give them that, Sarah?" Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't look away. "I made mistakes," she admitted. "But they need their mother. They need someone who puts them first," James shot back. "Not someone who spends their savings on hotels and jewelry. Not someone who—" "I wasn't thinking," she interrupted, her voice cracking. I wasn't myself." James shook his head, his frustration boiling over. "That's not good enough, Sarah. Not for them. Not for me." She sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. For a moment, James felt a pang of sympathy. This was the woman he'd once loved, the mother of his children. But that wasn't enough anymore. "I'm not trying to hurt you," he said quietly. "But I can't let this go on." Sarah looked up at him, her eyes red and swollen. "You're taking everything away from me." "No," James said firmly. "You're the one who gave it away." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah stood, clutching her purse to her chest. "If you do this, if you take them from me, I don't know what I'll do." James's resolve wavered, but only for a moment. "Then maybe it's time you figured that out." She left without another word, the door closing softly behind her. James sat back down at the table, the weight of the day settling over him like a heavy blanket. He didn't know what the future would bring, but for the first time in weeks, he felt like he was fighting for something that mattered. The sound of the gavel echoed in the courtroom, its sharp crack marking the end of what had been the most grueling months of James's life. The judge's voice was calm but firm. "Full custody of the children is awarded to Mr. James Miller. Miss Sarah Miller will retain supervised visitation rights." James sat motionless as the words sank in. Relief flooded through him, but it was accompanied by a pang of sadness. This wasn't how he'd wanted things to end, not like this. He glanced over at Sarah. She looked small, defeated, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her head was bowed, her shoulders slumped as though the weight of her choices had finally crushed her. Outside the courthouse, the crisp autumn air was sharp against James's face. His lawyer patted him on the back. "You did the right thing, James," Greg said. "This is what's best for your kids." James nodded, but he couldn't find the words to respond. Was it the right thing? He wasn't sure anymore. That night, James sat at the dining table while his children played in the living room. Their laughter filled the space, a stark contrast to the silence that had once consumed the house. For the first time in months, there was a sense of peace. Yet James couldn't shake the image of Sarah sitting alone in that courtroom. The following week, Sarah requested her first supervised visit. James was hesitant, but he knew it was inevitable. He watched from a distance as she sat with their children in the park. She tried to smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. She brought a stuffed bear for their daughter and a remote control car for their son, gifts that were received with polite gratitude but little enthusiasm. James felt a strange mix of emotions as he observed her. She looked like a shadow of the woman he had once loved. Her makeup barely hid the dark circles under her eyes, her movements tentative, like she was afraid of breaking something fragile. "Daddy, is Mommy staying with us again?" his daughter asked later that night. Her big, hopeful eyes made James's heart ache. "No, sweetheart," James said softly. "But she loves you very much. She just needs some time to figure things out." The girl nodded, though her small frown betrayed her disappointment. James kissed her on the forehead, silently promising himself that he would do everything in his power to make up for the void Sarah had left. Meanwhile, Sarah began attending therapy as part of the court's requirements. Her therapist, a kind but firm woman named Dr. Patel, didn't let her off the hook easily. "Why do you think you made those choices, Sarah?" she asked during one session. Sarah hesitated, her fingers twisting the hem of her sweater. "I felt invisible," she admitted. "Like no one saw me, like I didn't matter." Dr. Patel leaned forward, her voice calm but piercing. "And now? Do you think what you did made you matter?" The question hit Sarah harder than she'd expected. Tears welled in her eyes as she shook her head. "No, it just made everything worse." The weeks turned into months, and Sarah's visits with the children became a routine. Slowly, they began to warm to her again. Her son showed her how to drive the remote control car she had given him, laughing as it skidded through the grass. Her daughter hugged the stuffed bear tightly, whispering thank you before running off to play. For James, watching these moments was bittersweet. He didn't trust Sarah, not yet, but he could see glimpses of the person she used to be. And though he knew he had done the right thing by taking custody, part of him wished she could find her way back to the family she had abandoned. One night, as James was sorting through the mail, he found an envelope addressed to him. The handwriting was shaky but familiar. He opened it to find a letter from Sarah. "James, I don't know how to say this, so I'll just start with the truth. I'm sorry for everything. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness and I won't ask for it, but I need you to know that I'm trying to be better, trying to be the mother our kids deserve. I'll never forgive myself for what I've done, but I hope that one day they can. Thank you for taking care of them when I couldn't." Sarah James read the letter twice, his emotions swirling in ways he couldn't quite define. He tucked it into the drawer where he kept important documents, unsure of what to do with it. That weekend, during another visit, Sarah watched the kids play from a park bench. James approached her, his hands shoved into his pockets. For a moment they sat in silence, watching the children chase each other through the grass. "I got your letter," he said finally. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "And I believe you're trying," he said, his tone guarded but sincere. "For their sake, I hope you don't stop." Sarah nodded, a faint smile playing on her lips. "I won't." As James watched his kids laugh and play, he felt something shift inside him. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a step, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough for now. The warm rays of the late spring sun bathed the park in a golden glow, casting long shadows across the soft grass. James sat on a bench, his hands resting on his knees as he watched his children play on the swings. Their laughter, light and unburdened, drifted through the air, a sound he hadn't fully appreciated until now. He felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for months. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from resolution or closure. It was the peace of moving forward, of learning to let go of what he couldn't control. For the first time in a long time, the weight on his shoulders felt lighter. "Daddy, look at me," his daughter called, standing triumphantly on the highest step of the jungle gym. She waved wildly, her small figure outlined against the sun. "I see you, sweetheart," James called back, a wide smile spreading across his face. "Be careful." She laughed, the sound so pure that it made his chest tighten with gratitude. Gratitude for moments like this, for the chance to rebuild the life he thought he'd lost. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen and saw Sarah's name. He hesitated before answering, his voice steady. "Hey." "Hi," Sarah said, her tone cautious. "I was wondering if I could come by tomorrow, to drop off some things for the kids, just for a little while." James glanced at his children, their carefree joy a stark contrast to the tension that still lingered between him and Sarah. "Yeah," he said after a moment. "That's fine." "Thank you," she said softly. "I appreciate it." The call ended, leaving James staring at the phone for a moment longer. Sarah's visits had become less strained over the past few weeks, her efforts to rebuild a connection with the kids clear in her actions. She was trying. That much was undeniable. Whether it would ever be enough was a question James wasn't ready to answer. Later that evening, after the kids were asleep, James stood in the kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator filling the quiet. He looked at the stack of mail on the counter and noticed an envelope tucked between the bills. It was plain, with no return address, but something about it caught his attention. He opened it carefully, pulling out a single folded piece of paper. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the message was clear. "Thank you for exposing Ryan. Because of you, he can't hurt anyone else. I hope you find the happiness you deserve." James read the note twice, the weight of its words settling over him. It wasn't signed, but he didn't need to know who had written it. The impact of his actions had rippled farther than he'd imagined, and for the first time, he felt a sense of purpose in the chaos he'd endured. The next day, Sarah arrived at the house. She carried a small bag, her steps tentative as she approached the door. James opened it, his expression neutral. "Come in." The kids rushed to greet her, their excitement evident in the way they clung to her legs. Sarah knelt to hug them, her face lighting up in a way that James hadn't seen in years. He watched from the doorway, his emotions a complicated mix of hope and caution. As the afternoon wore on, James noticed small changes in Sarah, the way she listened intently as their daughter told a long, winding story. The way she laughed when their son demonstrated a silly dance. It wasn't much, but it was enough to show him that she was trying. When it was time for her to leave, Sarah lingered at the door. She looked at James, her eyes searching his face. "Thank you," she said, "for giving me this chance." James nodded, his voice quiet but firm. "It's for them, not for us." "I know," she replied, her gaze dropping, "but it means more than you know." After she left, James stepped outside, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon. The colors of the sky shifted from gold to deep orange, a reminder that endings often brought new beginnings. He thought about the life he was building, the strength he'd found in his children, and the resilience he'd discovered within himself. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid. As he turned to go back inside, his daughter called out from the living room, "Daddy, can you read us a story?" James smiled, his heart full. "Of course, sweetheart," he said, stepping into the light of the home he was rebuilding one day at a time. What do you think of Sarah's actions? Share your thoughts in the comments below. On a scale from 0 to 10, how would you rate this story? Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to follow all our stories. And don't forget to check out more heartwarming tales by clicking here on the end screen.